Tonight, we welcome all the way from Tokyo, journalist Robert Whiting. Robert is an author who has lived in Tokyo on and off for more than a half century. He's one of only a few Western writers to have a regular newspaper column in Japanese. He's the author of several highly successful books on Japan, including the best-selling Pulitzer Prize nominated You Gotta Have Wa. He's also written Tokyo Underworld, Fast Times and Hard Life of an American Gangster in Japan, which is being adapted by Oscar-nominated screenwriter Terrence Winter, who also produced shows you might have heard of, Vinyl, The Sopranos, and one of my all-time favorites, Boardwalk Empire. Bob receives high praise from our own Pico Iyer, author of The Lady and the Monk and The Beginner's Guide to Japan. He's the writer that says he is the wisest, most seasoned, and funniest voice on Japan. High praise from somebody who's an accomplished writer himself. In his latest book, he opens himself up with the Stonebridge Press published memoir, Tokyo Junkie, 60 Years of Bright Lights and Back Alleys and Baseball. The Atlantic calls it a delightful book, a wry, vivid, and illuminating account of a country, a culture, and a keenly observant character through 5 dramatic decades. And I can wholeheartedly agree. It's interesting, it's funny, it's sad, sometimes even on the same page. Please welcome from Tokyo, Bob Whiting. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we have some technical difficulties. We are unable to show you some images. We do have Bob, which is more than enough. I'm so glad to finally meet you after reading You Gotta Have Wa. I mean, it's not just a baseball book, it's about American and Japanese cultures, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to talk about your book, Tokyo Junkie. Judging from the title, is it safe to assume that Tokyo is your drug of choice?
It's my what? My what?
Your
choice?
Drug of choice.
Oh, yes, it is.
Your
yes.
drug.
Every time I try to get away, it keeps pulling me back. So yes, I'm addicted to the city, just the energy and the activity, and I just can't get enough of it. I've lived everywhere. I mean, I've lived in New York for several years. I lived in Geneva, Vienna, Paris and Stockholm with my wife, who worked for the UNHCR. I've been spent a lot of time in Seoul and Singapore and Hong Kong. And I think that this city right now is the greatest city in the world. It's the number one on so many different metrics, GDP, best subway train system in the world, more Michelin-starred restaurants than any other city in the world, twice as many as Paris. It's got a low crime rate, a high IQ rate, the longest life expectancy of any major city in the world, the best healthcare system of any major city in the world. That's got the politest people. I left a wallet on the Yokosuka line one time with 100,000 yen in it. They came back to me about a week later in the mail with the note that be careful of your wallet. And in just so many different ways right now. Even, in fact, Global Finance did a survey last November, and they named Tokyo as the most livable city in the world, considering all the different metrics I mentioned and some that I forgot, as well as the COVID-19. We're in a bit of a lockdown now, another state of emergency. There's a fourth wave. I hope we're still here a week from now after I've gotten through saying all that.
Well, I hope so too. You didn't start out to go to Tokyo for your whole life. You were just a young man. Was it 1964 when you came over, or was it 63?
62.
62. And they're getting ready for the Olympics.
I was in the military,
Mhm.
1962, and I requested Berlin. They called me in and said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I want to go to Berlin," because I was in the intelligence business. That's where they stuck me. And,
Mhm.
Berlin was spy central, but then they sent me to Japan. I had no knowledge of Tokyo. The only thing I knew about Tokyo was it was from the Godzilla movie, the badly dubbed Godzilla movie. Uh, so, but I just remember the first time in Tokyo just being overwhelmed by everything, just the crowds and uh, the energy of the place. It just
Yeah.
sucked you in. And at night when you walk through Tokyo, these neon signs came out, and it was just really spectacular. There are more bars and restaurants, it was said, per kilometer in Tokyo than any other city in the world. And what was amazing about it was that they were rebuilding the city for the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. So you could stand on one street, say Skiabashi, and
Mhm.
there'd be on one side of the street, they'd putting a building up, and on the other, they'd be tearing it down. And it was just amazing when they got the bid, when Tokyo got the bid to host the Olympics, the they had no infrastructure to speak of. There were just these really primitive roadways, very low buildings, only one five-star hotel, the Imperial, which was, falling into disrepair.
Mhm.
You couldn't drink the water, there were rats everywhere. And within a span of 6 years, or 5 years, excuse me, they put up 10,000 new buildings, 8 expressways, 2 new subway lines to go to 2 they already had, a monorail that went from Haneda into the center of the city, and the bullet train, which went back and forth between Osaka and Tokyo
Mhm.
at whatever it was, a couple hundred kilometers. And it was just this amazing transformation that was shown worldwide when the Olympics were shown on satellite television, the opening ceremony.
Mhm.
And it was so impressive that they turned this high-tech megalopolis overnight. They put up 5 five-star hotels, the Okuda, the New Otani,
Yeah.
and 3 others. The James Bond people came to Tokyo to film, after the Olympics ended, to film You Only Live Twice, which showcased the city.
Mhm.
So it was really addicted. I just
Yeah.
couldn't, when my, duty ended with the military, I decided to stay, and I went to Sophia University, the Jesuit school.
Mhm. And also that you taught English, and you had a
That's the
best friendo, Dr. Sato. Oh, can you hear me
right.
okay?
So you could, every Japanese wanted to learn. Yeah, I can. You're breaking up. This is
Mhm.
the connection. It could be better. But can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. It's just freezing up a little bit.
Well, so everybody all Japanese in the city wanted to learn English, it seemed, and there weren't enough English teachers. So anybody, you're walking down the street, you could be from some one-horse town in Oklahoma with a 6th degree education, and you could be teaching English at some school. They're actually using 10-year-old American kids where they were paying them to teach English at these schools. And I met this one doctor Dr. Sato, he was a plastic surgeon. His job was to make all these nightclub hostesses look beautiful. And he took me around, introduced me to everything. It was quite an experience. And he took me to this really expensive nightclub, our hostess club called the Le Dead Rat, which I think was, so mistaken attempt to translate l'amour, love, into English. L'amour, but they called it the Dead Rat. And these girls wanted to learn English, and so I went down there Saturday afternoon, and they would come in their hair and curlers and blue jeans and smoking cigarettes and chewing gum and no makeup and look like completely different people. Just ruined the image that they were trying to. And they all hated their jobs. They were just doing it because it paid well and they wanted to do something else, like, get a job in a company, be a secretary, start their own stores. But it was quite this nightclub where a lot of famous athletes and movie stars came. Katsu Shintaro, who played Zatoichi, Taiho, the Yokozuna sumo wrestler. So it was quite an introduction to Tokyo. Quite something.
Yeah. Plus, you were given the inside view of something that the typical gaijin wouldn't, from your experience, weren't you? As far as your friendship with Dr. Sato. So did you say it was like perfect timing for you to be, to teach him and be a part of this? Would you say it was luck or?
Well, it was supply and demand. I enrolled in, I took a course at Sophia University. As I recall, there was a sign on the bulletin board, and that's how I first contacted him. And, the Japan Times was filled with advertisements of people wanting English teachers. And I remember the opening ceremony of the Olympic game, went to his apartment with his wife, and there were a couple of actresses, Japanese actresses there in their very quaint mini skirts. And watching this in expensive apartment in Harajuku overlooking National Stadium, and watching the opening ceremony. And these people, there were tears in their eyes. I mean, it was really a powerful moment for Japan, because they had, this was their re-entry into the world after the defeat and destruction of the Second World War, the Pacific War, the Japanese. And quite something. And there were 3 events in that Olympics that, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes?
No, it's all right. Go ahead.
3 events in these Olympics that were really memorable from the Japanese point of view. One was the open weight judo final between Japan champion Akio Kaminaga and this Dutch 6'6" Dutch judoist Anton Heesing, and he won. He defeated the Japanese, and this was really a shock to the Japanese, who thought that superior fighting spirit and technique, that any Japanese could be anyone else in the world. And it was really a crushing blow. I remember watching this standing in front of an electronics store in Ginza on this showroom TV, and people were really dejected. And then there was the marathon, and this guy Kokichi Tsuburaya came into the stadium second. He was headed for the silver medal. Abebe Bikila, the Ethiopian, had gotten the gold. And then here comes Basil Heatley up, like a bat out of hell. And passed
Yeah.
him at the finish line. And so he wound up with the bronze, and this was so devastating that he apologized to everybody. And he wound up committing suicide later, preparing for the Mexico City Games, because he didn't think he could, he was supposed to make up to get the silver or the gold.
Yeah.
That failed, so he's risked. And then the final night of the Olympics, the final event was the women's volleyball team, and Japanese women's volleyball team, which was famous. They were called the Witches of the Orient by this Russian newspaper. They were famous for their brutal training regime. They would practice 11 hours every day. That's not an exaggeration. This went from, like 3 in the afternoon until 2 in the morning. And they did this for a solid year. And the Soviet Union women's team was bigger and stronger, but the Japanese beat them in straight sets and won the gold medal.
Wow.
And they were watched by a viewing population that the video research said hit 95% on the final vote, which is the highest score of highest rating of any TV program in Japanese history to this day. And it was a survey at the end of the 20th century by the Asahi Shimbun of the top 10 sporting achievements by Japanese in the 100 years of the 20th century. And this came in like number 3 or number 4.
Oh, wow.
So it was quite remarkable. And it's proved that it showed that superior effort and fighting spirit could defeat someone who, could overcome superior physical strength. That was the lesson. And what the Japanese done to all Western sports dating back to the late 19th century when they opened up to the world is they grafted the philosophy of the martial arts, endless training, development of spirit, self-sacrifice, and they've applied it to all the baseball, soccer, rugby, whatever. And which is defined, the way they approach the game. You can see it in baseball. I've written a couple of books about it. But that was the lesson of the Olympics, to reaffirmation of the Japanese way of doing things, that fighting spirit, dedication, self-sacrifice will prevail in the end. So there was a dark side. Sorry.
I was wondering how it affected you to witness this of a people that you had no idea about, and to see them open themselves up, to see their joy, to see their sorrow. And how did it affect you to be able to witness the reactions of the people to these things?
Oh, it was quite moving. I remember watching the opening ceremony at this Dr. Sato's apartment, and there were tears in everyone's eyes, just tearing up at this amazing accomplishment they pulled off. When I first arrived in Tokyo, nobody thought that the Japanese would ever finish on time because they were so far behind. And they just decided, okay, we're going to do it. And they went on this 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week construction binge. And if you stayed in this, you needed thick black curtains to keep out the construction lights because they were everywhere. At 7 or 8 o'clock, after salarymen, left the office but had gone home, or they would start opening up the streets, for the subway construction, and this pile drivers were going on, like all night. So you had to go to sleep with earplugs on. And I remember this story about a student who was studying to get into Waseda. He was what they call a Ronin. He was taking an extra year off to study. And the pile driver, the noise from the pile driver bothered him so much he just went out and stuck his head underneath the pile driver and committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
Article.
Wow.
But it was just a phenomenal accomplishment. What they did, as I said before, you get the energy of the city. It just sucked you in, especially at that time because everybody was focused on this goal. And so when my time came up for discharge, and I had to choose between going back to the States and staying in Tokyo. Man, I was just so addicted to the place. I couldn't imagine leaving. So I enrolled in Sophia. There's a Jesuit university in Tokyo. It's connected to Georgetown and Loyola in the States. And I went there, studied political science. It's the best decision I ever made, I think.
But you also started writing about them, didn't you?
Well, I actually, this is, takes up half, a big chunk of the book, but I graduated from Sophia with a degree in political science, and I went to work for a Japanese company. It was Encyclopedia Britannica. They were selling encyclopedias, but it was owned by Japanese. And my job was in creating editorial projects. And, they were selling these, Japanese salesmen were selling $800 encyclopedias in English to people who couldn't read them by saying, if you have these in your house, your kids can get into Tokyo University. And there was this one guard who was arrested, one salesman who was arrested for being too aggressive. Would show up at people's houses at midnight, and wouldn't leave until they signed an agreement to, purchase the encyclopedia. So he was arrested in Kobe and thrown into jail. And while he was in jail, he sold 2 sets of the encyclopedias to the guards and was named Salesman of the Month for. My job was writing language courses for kids that they could sell. And they got in trouble with the law because of their behavior of their salesmen. So they had to stop selling encyclopedias for a while. So the work that I was doing helped the company, period. But I got involved with, I became a big baseball fan then. Because in the beginning, the only thing I could understand on television was the baseball game. There were a couple of Americans on each team, and every other word the announcers used was some English-derived word like home run or strike, auto, cabo, and home. And so that got me interested in. I started studying Japanese so that I could read the sports dailies every day. And that's how I learned to read Japanese, to read kanji. And I got involved with Japanese Yakuza. They were in my neighborhood. They were running a baseball betting pool. And I became friends with this guy who pulled me aside one night and he said, this 24-year-old tough-looking guy with scars, and he was their local enforcer. He said, I'm from Okinawa, and Japanese don't like Okinawans. He said, you're from America, and Japanese don't like Americans either. So let's be friends. And so he pulled me into the gang, and he took me to all their events, introduced me to and I'd done my graduation thesis on the Liberal Democratic Party, and I'd interviewed Yasuhiro Nakasone, who was this up-and-coming young Turk for the LDP, future prime minister. And they thought that was really great. He says, oh, we love the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan. You know, we support them. We get out the vote at election time. We make sure people vote for them. We, you know, we collect money and donate to the party. And they thought it was just great that I had met Nakasone.
Ah,
And anyway, one thing, another, but you know, that I wound up in a pretty dark place. And I was, you know, drinking every night and running around with these people. And the Britannica, they offered me, you know, the whole Gaijin expat package, expensive
yeah.
apartment in a big rate. I had to get out. I turned it down and I went back
Oh,
to New
really?
York. I moved to New York, you know, just as I was like 28, 29 years old. And I just wanted to see what I was made of. I could just see my life unfolding in Tokyo, and I didn't like what I saw. So anyway, I went back to New York. I went to New York, and I would talk to people, and they would ask me what Japan was like, and I would talk about the salarymen and the labor unions, and you know, the 12-hour days and all that. But it was when I started talking about baseball that they had this guy Sadaharu O, who took batting practice in the evening with a sword, slicing suspended from the ceiling. They have these martial arts drills, you know, where you field 1,000 balls in a row until you collapse from exhaustion. And that's what got people interested. So I wrote my first book, The Chrysanthemum and the Bat. And then I was in New York for 3 years. The book out, it got some attention. Time magazine did a story about it. And I was invited to go back to Tokyo with Time Life. I met the deadline in August 1975. And I had $120 in the bank. I was 32 years old, and my rent was $240. I didn't know how I was going to pay it. And the phone rang, and it was Time Life. I said, "How would you go to Tokyo?" And so they put me up at the Hotel New for 2 months, and then I got an apartment in Riki Mansion that was put up by this iconic professional wrestler, Ricky Dozan. Giant Baba was my upstairs neighbor. That was quite an experience. The Giant Baba, 6'10" 280-pound professional wrestler at the time, #1 guy in Tokyo.
Wow. So regarding baseball, you were able to interact with the greats like Sadaharu O and Nagashima, and to write about them. I mean, these are legends in not only sports, but in Japanese culture. And I just want to know what that was like to be able to interview these larger than life figures and talk to them.
Well, Nagashima was kind of a showboat. We went to his house. I was working with this crew from Canada with the baseball player Gary Carter. And just to set up a meeting at Nagashima's house, and we went there. And Nagashima had he had a picture of. He knew that Gary Carter was from Canada, and that Carter was Catholic. So in the Genkan, as we went in the house, there were 2 photos. One is a photo with Nagashima and Pierre Trudeau, who was then the Prime Minister of Canada, and another with Nagashima with the Pope. You know, just to make. But then on the walls, you know, there are pictures of him with, I don't know, Ronald Reagan and, you know, Richard Gere, all these, you know, Steve McQueen. It's like he's met everybody famous who's ever existed and was photographed with him. And he looks at me and he points to the picture, says, "These are best friendo. They're all my best friends." Oh, on the other hand, was just as humble and nice as could be. He had his favorite chair was in the shape of a glove, an infielder's glove, this big leather thing. So he made sure that I sat down in that chair, and he went into the kitchen and made coffee for us and brought it out him. He's just a super nice guy. He's one of the best people I've ever met. Really,
And
the dignity.
for a while, he wasn't as accepted because his father was Chinese or from Taiwan by the Japanese people. Isn't that correct?
Well, he wasn't a citizen. His father was a refugee from mainland China and moved to Taiwan. And then he came to Tokyo and married a Japanese. And and his brother were born. His brother became a doctor and a baseball player. And so because he wasn't a citizen, he couldn't play in some national tournament, which got a lot of attention. But there were, Warren Cromartie came over. He used to play for the Expos, and he played for the Yomiuri in the 1980s. And he said, his comment to me was, "Well, I'm a black son of a bitch, and I can tell a racist a mile away." And he said, "Those people in Yomiuri were racist. When Nagashima came around, they, would bow down and kiss his ass." And he said, they kind of treated like, hired help. He said, you could clearly see the difference. And it was true. They made, Yomiuri made, they gave Nagashima this title, a lifetime honorary member. I forget exactly what it was, but he's like an honorary chairman of Yomiuri, of the Giants. And wound up in Fukuoka with SoftBank Hawks, which had a Korean owner, Masayoshi Son. Was by far the better player.
Yeah.
I mean, Nagashima was very good. I mean, was the world home run record holder. And Hank Aaron thought that Sadaharu was just the greatest thing he'd ever seen.
Yeah.
He met him several times. They had a home run contest together. And he said that could have been a superstar in the States if he played. He said, where Nagashima might have done okay, but he wouldn't have been O's caliber.
And O has won.
He hit 868 career home runs. He won like 10 home run crowns in a row. When he was 40 years old, he hit 35 home runs. He dropped down from 40s. And he said, I can't do this anymore. This is embarrassing. So he retired. But he learned to hit on one leg. He had a hitch in his swing. So there was this Aikido teacher, this Aikido sensei, who met on his, school ground, the practice session. And he had this big, really bad hitch in his swing. And when joined the Giants, he wasn't very good. He was on the farm team most of his first couple seasons. So this guy, Arakawa, taught to hit on one leg. He says that will eliminate the hitch. It will improve your timing. And he did it. It's amazing to see. And it wasn't this kind of thing where you lift your leg and you step into the pitch. He just stood there. It looked like some, flamingo at Lake Nakuru in Kenya, stand, make sure, eating. That's what he looked like when he hit. And it was just the most amazing thing. He could do that. Nobody else could hit like that.
Wow. And
And he
he
used to
played for
take
the
this,
Giants.
he would take these, pardon?
Oh, no, go ahead. Finish.
And so he had this samurai sword, long sword, and he would practice at night on the road to suspend this A4 piece of paper from the ceiling, and then he would, swing and try to slice it in half, which is very hard to do because the force of the swing, creates air pressure and blows the paper out of the way. So you have to break your wrists at just the right time. So he developed these really powerful wrists. It's very hard to do what he did. There's video of it on the internet. If you look it up, there's black and white film of him doing this. So you can see.
Was this based, watching them, I know you already wrote Chrysanthemum and the Bat, but to write Gotta Have Wah, what was this the inspiration for you, or did you have another inspiration to write You Gotta Have Wah?
Well, when I wrote Chrysanthemum and the Bat, it became Time Life had brought me back. The book had just come out, and Time Life had sent me back to Tokyo. And I worked on this project for a year. And translation of Chrysanthemum and the Bat came out, and it was a bestseller. And so I started getting offers. I did some work for Sports Illustrated and the airline magazines, and then I did a regular column for the Japanese daily sports paper, and Shukan Bunshu and Bungeshi, some of these others. And I really didn't know how to write when I did Chrysanthemum and the Bat. I just tried to copy what other writers did. I didn't know anything about structure and narrative. And Malcolm Gladwell says you have to put in 10,000 hours to be really proficient at something. Well, during that period, I put in my 10,000 hours, and I learned how to write. I learned my craft. And then the bubble hit. The global trade disputes with Japan started. Well, first the trade dispute started, and as a result, that was the Plaza Accord, where they revalued the yen to twice its former value against the dollar. And Japan became enormously wealthy. Top 10. They had half the cash in the world, and they started buying up Columbia Studios and Rockefeller Center. And so that gave someone, I did a piece in the Smithsonian, and somebody in New York read it and asked me to do a book, and that turned out to be You Gotta Have Wah. And you gotta have, if Chrysanthemum and Bat was about the Japanese national character through sports, through baseball, You Gotta Have Wah was about the inability of Japanese and Americans to get along, because their worldview, their philosophy, just so different. It's like oil and water. American individualism, it just doesn't work in Japan, where the group is the most important thing. So that was the point of that. And it got a lot of attention. It was a bestseller because everybody was talking about Japan at the time. That's when the movie, what's the Sean Connery movie?
Black Rain?
The Michael novel. Not Black Rain, that came out a few years later, but there was, it comes right on the tip of my tongue. Sean Connery plays as a Japan expert. And anyway, everybody knows who it is. I just can't remember it. Michael Crichton's novel about Japanese business, taking over.
Rising Sun. Rising Sun.
I can't believe something like that. Yes, okay. So I guess that means I'm getting old or something. I can't remember. It's the onset of dementia. So that was that period, and then the success of You Gotta Have Wah enabled me to do Tokyo Underworld. My agent said, whatever you don't write another book about baseball. So I did this Cromartie book, Slugging. But then I did Tokyo Underworld, which was quite a learning experience. That was, took a lot of research and effort.
Mhm. But first of all, Cromartie's great to write about. I was there in '87 when he played so well and just riled up and brought the Giants on the brink of the World Series, the Japan Series. That was a
Yeah. Well, he was great because he would say anything, anything. He just didn't have a filter. And, like I'm a black son of a bitch and I can spot a racist a mile away, that kind of thing. He was just really funny. And he would tell these great stories about bottom of the ninth inning, bases loaded, Hadas in the on deck circle, Tatsunori Hada, their big, golden boy cleanup. And he said Hada just turned pale from the pressure of this. His face was white. So Cromartie says, I've got to distract him, get him to think about something else. So he tells this story about he knows that Hada likes dogs. So they're standing there in Korakuen Stadium, 50,000 people watching, bases loaded, they're changing the pitcher. Hada's about to, have a heart attack from the pressure. And Cromartie saying, you like dog, right? Inu, dog ga ski. And Hada said, what? He said, oof, bow, wow, bow, dogu. And Hada starts laughing. And so they start talking about dogs. Takes Hada's mind off the situation. Then he goes up to the plate and he hits a single and the Giants win the game. He has just filled stories like that. It's just a real pleasure to interview.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to Tokyo Underworld in a minute, but I wanted to ask: Are you still banned by the Tokyo Yomiuri Giants from covering their games? Because I heard that you were banned for life.
Well, the first time I did an interview with Cromartie, and it came out, and he made this remark about the front office people being racist. They didn't like that, so they banned me from the stadium for 2 years. Cromartie won the batting championship in the MVP there, so they couldn't ban him.
Yeah.
They had to give him a raise, but they got me. I couldn't go in. As a reporter. And then they moved into the Tokyo Dome, and this was in 1988, 89. And the Tokyo Dome is modeled after the Metrodome in Minnesota. And they claimed that they got 56,000 people every night. That was the capacity of the stadium, and that's what they got. And they would put this on the electronic scoreboard, 56,000. And the Yomiuri Shimbun would report it, and this would be on their Yomiuri TV channel. TV they would telecast the Giants games nationwide every night. They'd make a point of pointing out this 56,000 every game, the world record, so many consecutive 56,000. So I counted the seats, and I found that there's only 42,761 seats in the dome. And I counted the Japanese reporter and I went out and counted the standing people, the standing room crowd.
Yeah.
And something like 3,500 there's not much room to stand in the Tokyo Dome. And then I found out, somebody told me on B3, the third floor down of the basement in the Tokyo Dome, there's a sign on a door, which I saw, put up by the fire department. It says capacity 46,134. So I wrote about this in the Weekly Asahi. It's a weekly magazine published by the Asahi Shimbun, Japan's second largest newspaper. And of course, the Asahi is the mortal enemy of the Yomiuri Shimbun. And so when that came out, some guy called me up and he says, "Well, I've been informed, been asked to tell you, please don't come to the Tokyo Dome anymore. So you're not welcome." So I didn't go back until there was the Major League opening day in 2003 or something. I played in Tokyo. And Marvin Miller's son, Peter Miller, got me a seat, the best seat in the press box. Made a statement. So that's when I went after, several years, 15 years, I think.
Oh, wow. So we'll get to the questions in a moment, but I would be remiss without asking, of all the interesting people you've met, including having a friendship with the great David Halberstam, I want to talk a little bit about Nixa Petty in Tokyo Underworld, and about how Tokyo Underworld come about, because it's going to be a movie or a television series in the near future. And I think people would like to know who Nixa Petty is.
Right. Well, Nixa Petty is from East Harlem, New York. He's an Italian. He came to Japan in 1945 in the Marines. He fought in the Pacific, and he wound up. He took a discharge and worked for the GHQ, the Civil Property Custodian Division, but he was hunting down properties that had been confiscated by Japanese military during the war and returning it to their owners. And he got involved in the black market. He was arrested, deported, had his mafia friends in New York, gave him a passport back to Japan, was set up another black market operation, was involved in the diamond robbery of the Imperial Hotel, arrested again, and somehow he managed to stay. He had a good lawyer. You could do stuff like that at the time in the 50s. And he opened up a restaurant, Italian restaurant, and introduced pizza to Roppongi. And it was a big hit. And so he was still doing black market. He was selling guns on the side. He was doing all sorts of things. But I always thought I used to go eat there. I always thought he was a little scary, so I stayed away from him. But he came up to me one day in 19, and he had a copy of You Gotta Have Wa in his hand. And he said, "Did you write this book?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, have I got a story for you?" Just 4 marriages, 3 divorces, 2 fortunes, 1 in loss, deportations, arrests, best friends with Riki Dozan and the crime boss of Tokyo, Genzamachi. So he started telling me incredible stories. About being involved in crime. He said he opened up his Roppongi restaurant in Genzamachi, the crime boss of Tokyo, the Tosei Kai. And Riki Dozan used to come. Riki Dozan was this wrestling champion, former sumo wrestler who introduced professional wrestling to Japan. Big, tall, brawny Korean guy who had to hide his ethnicity because at the time, Japanese didn't want Korean. They wanted pure-blooded Japanese heroes. And so he started defeating Americans on TV in Japan. And the enormous professional wrestling boom helped Japanese recover from the sting of defeated war. And so Riki Dozan and Genzamashi used to come around, and they would go out to rival. Some guy opened up a restaurant selling pizza, so they went and just staged a fist fight on Nick's behalf. Riki Dozan and Genzamachi. Genzamachi was this big, 6 foot, bulky Korean guy.
Yeah.
They staged a fist fight and destroyed the restaurant. So the guy could no longer be a competitor to Nixa Petty. That's the kind of so, and he had he got married in 1947. He married a Japanese Catholic, a dentist who was Catholic, and she divorced him. They had 2 kids. She said he was just incorrigible.
Mhm.
Had no business being married. Then he married, opened up the restaurant, married a girl, and then he divorced her, and his wife wound up with half his empire. And then he married this 19-year-old beauty queen from Hokkaido, who he said started butterflying on him, and he brought her down to Tokyo, and she started taking the company limousine with this chauffeur and having these assignations with the singer Fusei Akira, the famous singer, the one who married Olivia Hussey. And he found out about it, and he said, "You embarrassed me. I can't show my face in Tokyo anymore because you cheated on me behind my back." So he says, "You're not going to leave this house alive tonight." He says, "You can either go up and kill yourself or I'll do it for you." This is his daughter from his first marriage came back at that time, and she says, "Where's so and so?" Mayumi was her name. Go upstairs, and she's lying on the floor. She'd slit her wrists, and said, "So we got to get her to the hospital." So they get her to the hospital, and then she survived, and she sued him for 10 million yen, I think, and it's the only lawsuit that he ever won. He lost all his other lawsuits by his wives and the divorces.
Yeah.
But stories like that, I couldn't put that in Tokyo Underworld because I talked to her, and she had returned to Sapporo, and she married this Buddhist priest who was the head of the cemetery in Sapporo, and she had an 8-year-old son. If you put this in the book, it's going to make, the word will get around to the school where my son goes. It will just make his life miserable. So I had to take it out, but maybe I'll get it in the movie.
Okay. So speaking of which, how did the movie come about? I heard that Martin Scorsese was attached at the beginning, but it's changed hands a little bit, and now you have Terrence Winter.
Well, it started out at DreamWorks, and Nick Pileggi was the Goodfellas and Casino guy was doing this. And Spielberg changed his mind halfway through. He wanted a comedy. He wanted to do a family. He said this. Pileggi had done a 3-hour R-rated script with lots of sex and violence. And Spielberg said it was too long. So we want something more family friendly. And so they had it for 7 years. They went through 14 different divisions. And at the end, Ben Stiller was involved, and it was a PG-13 family comedy, 90 minutes long. And then they couldn't get anybody to direct it. And then it went to Warner Brothers. And Scorsese was going to do it for Warner Brothers. In fact, I met him in New York. I spent an afternoon with him in his office, and the directors of his waiting room is a little mini movie theater with about 100 seats. You can pick any movie you want, and they'll show it while you're waiting for it. And he was going to do it, but he had won the Oscar for The Departed, and he'd signed a 5-picture deal with Paramount. And the Tokyo Underworld was supposed to be done by the same team that had done The Departed, Dan Lin and Scorsese directing. They had a writer. And when Paramount found out that he was doing that. Paramount, by the way, had a joint venture with DreamWorks. It didn't work out, but they came away with the sterile scripts, the old scripts to Tokyo Underworld.
Yeah.
And first, they said they wanted $1 million for that, or they were going to sue Warner Bros. And then they found out Scorsese was going to direct it, which made them upset because he just signed a 5-picture deal with Paramount as well.
Yeah.
So they raised the price to $2 million. The Warner Brothers president said, "The hell with this, let's forget about it." Then it went to HBO, and Scorsese was going to do it, executive director with Paul Schrader. But the HBO people didn't like Paul Schrader's script, and they went with Girls instead. This was 2012. Then it went to Amazon, and they had a guy named David Scarpa wrote the script. He did this. David Scarpa did the movie about J. Paul Getty, All the Money in the World. And then, but a new president in Amazon, and he said, no period movies. It's all got to be present day. Or anyway, they dropped it. So now it's at Legendary Global. And I think it's going to, Terrence Winter, who did Wolf of Wall Street, is writing it. And Sherry Marsh is the producer. She did the Vikings and Pose. I think it'll work out. But who knows?
I think it will. It's in good hands with Terrence Winter. We have a question here from Lauren.
He's a really nice.
Yeah. Okay, Bobson, your book is filled with vivid descriptions and clear insights. Thanks for sharing with us all. I lived in Japan myself, 1973 to 83, and have continued to travel between the San Francisco Bay Area and Tokyo on business many times a year. Given the impact that the 1964 Olympics had on Tokyo, which you explained so wonderfully in Tokyo Junkie, what do you think the impact will be of the 2020 Olympics during the ongoing pandemic?
Well, we're in the middle of the 4th wave now, and they're insisting that they're going to hold these Olympics because there's so much money involved in. They've banned foreign spectators because of the pandemic. They say that the athletes who come are going to be kept in a bubble, that they can't gather in groups. When they eat, they have to eat in like groups of 2 or 3, that's all. No parties, they can't go outside the bubble. I think what's going to happen, I think there's a very good chance that, say, some country like Australia or New Zealand will pull out. That's what happened last time. Because, they have 0 cases in Australia and New Zealand. And so they're going to come to Tokyo and risk bringing COVID back. It's going to be they have 6, I don't know how many, 50 or 60,000 people associated with the athletes, with the games that are supposed to come in. And the government says they're not going to require these people to be vaccinated, but they're going to restrict their movements and do constant testing, daily testing. I don't know about you, but the 20-year-old Olympic athletes that I know are not going to be kept in a bubble. They're going to find a way to get out and hit roppongi at night after their events.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big danger. They could turn into this giant petri dish. So I don't know. My personal guess is that they'll have to cancel. 2/3 of the Japanese public does not want these games to be held now. 1/3 says they should be completely. The other says put off until some other time, postpone. but the public doesn't want it. It's the business politicians. They got too much money invested. If they cancel, they're going to lose an enormous amount of money.
Yes, indeed. And that's what it comes down to.
Yes.
One more question, and then I'll close. Claudio Rodriguez from Toronto. I'm interested to know some milestones of the development of Tokyo from the past 60 years, like the moment when Japanese vehicles took over the American ones, like when the city transformed itself from a polluted, filthy place to the immaculate, pristine one we know today.
What was the beginning of that question again? What memorable moments?
The milestones of development of Tokyo from the past 60 years. Vehicles and when the city itself transformed itself from being dirty.
Well, 1964, Tokyo, transformed itself from this, polluted backwater into a high-tech megalopolis that led the world in satellite and clock and watch technology developed for the Olympics. That was a key moment. I think the 1977 when Sadaharu broke Hank Aaron's career home run record. That was a huge moment for the Japanese. I think the Lockheed scandal, when it was discovered that American Aircraft Company was bribing the Japanese government to buy its airplanes. 1980, the late 80s and the late 70s and early 80s, when the Japanese were flooding the world with cars, superior, I might add, cars, cameras, tape recorders, and whatever. The Plaza Accord, when a decision by the finance ministers of the top, the G6 nations, agreed to work together to revalue the yen to control this flood of Japanese exports. And the value of the yen went from 240 yen to the dollar to 120 yen to the dollar in a period of 18 months. And Japan had so much money. The top 10 banks in the world were Japanese. Half the cash in the world was in Japanese hands. Prices got so expensive that there's people who owned this little restaurant in Harajuku sold out to a company that put up the Gap building. They made a fortune. The people were buying, the property got so expensive that people had to take out 100-year loans to buy an apartment. And then the bubble burst in 1989 when the emperor died, and people were stuck with these loans. And it's just a tragedy what happened. They're still paying off 3-generation loans.
Wow.
The highlights, and then the earthquake and tsunami of 2011 was certainly a milestone. I mean, in a terrible event, but it was, I think I wrote about this in Tokyo JUNKIE, but the Japanese turned in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of lost cash. Can you imagine that? In Fukushima, people just lost their wallets, and people would take the money to the police box and turn it in. It's just amazing.
I want to close by asking, you, Bob. It's a wonderful book. You've written several books before, but what was it like to put yourself, your own story out there into a memoir?
It was very difficult. I've come to the conclusion that a memoir is the hardest thing to do. You know, this originally started with the Japan Times series, 25,000 word retrospective on the Olympics, and Kadokawa asked me to put it into a memoir. And it's very difficult because you don't, you know, doing regular nonfiction like I do, I have a sixth sense. I know what's interesting and what isn't, what will work. You know, if I smirk when I write something, I say, oh, this makes me laugh. So, you know, the people who read it will laugh. But when you do a memoir, you're really out at sea because you don't know whether you're asking the right questions of yourself or you're giving yourself the right answers. It's too easy to make up something in a situation in which you come out looking good. You know what I mean? And you have to be tell the truth, and you know you have to describe these incidents in which you did not act very honorably, you know, which I did. I mean, so I think I wound up with an honest version of myself, but it took several drafts. It normally takes 10 drafts to do a book at least, but this one was over 20, 25. I had to ask people to read it and give me feedback. It's very difficult. I'm glad I only have to do it once.
Well, Bob, thank you very much, everyone. Tokyo Junkie, 60 years of bright lights, back alleys and baseball. Bob Whiting, thank you for joining us. Everyone, thank you for joining us. It's a wonderful book. Please buy it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Sayonara.